Hello everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I am your resident fantasy therapist and welcome back to my channel. Those of you who are returning, welcome back. Always good to see you again. Those of you who are brand new, welcome. Glad to see you. My name is Kat Bowser, and as I said, I am a fantasy therapist because I am a licensed therapist, but I am also an author working on my first debut novel. So on my channel, I like to explore what I feel is the heart of writing, which is, well, with no big surprise, the psychology behind it. And so I like to talk about all things writing, how you develop worlds, how you develop magic, how you develop characters, all that fun stuff. So for today, I wanted to touch on a video that has actually been requested by several people, but most specifically, Tropetrinitytrilogy, great name by the way, requested that I talk about how my career as a therapist affects my writing. So it seemed like a fun topic, and I always love to talk about my writing in any form. I think every author does. So I thought, why not? So that's what we're going to touch on today, is how being a therapist essentially molds my writing. So honestly, I feel to start off, you really got to start at the beginning, which is, when did I get interested in psychology? And the answer might surprise you. These guys. These guys. I grew up on the Disney afternoon. I still think it is probably some of my favorite shows. And I'm proud of that. I still think those cartoons are extremely well done. But as for how it affected me getting interested in psychology, that's actually an interesting question, because prior to this point, I was probably 6 or 7 when I started watching the Disney Afternoon. And for some reason, I was always drawn to characters that did not have a lot of screen time. And I really don't know why that is. But when that happened, the show would never give a lot of detail on where they came from or why they were acting like they were or what goals they were after. And I would sit there and try to figure it out. I ended up doing I think a 3-page essentially it was a non-official diagnosis digging into the personality and background of a character that appeared twice. In fact, one of the things that I ended up doing with one of these cartoons is I took a character and I gave them a culture that had not existed. And before I knew it, I was adding religion, I was adding language, I was adding customs. And it became so developed that it really became a separate culture from where it started. And that was my first, really my first dig into world building, and I loved it. And you will actually see that culture reflected in my work, because I continued to work on it and perfect it. And honestly, I'm pretty proud of it. And I think that is really where my love of psychology started, because when I started thinking about what drove this character, what kind of goals they might have, I started to look at the characters that did have background info. And I started to look at, well, this really does affect how they act. And I was fascinated. Like, finding out that your past and your background could have so much effect on your present, I could not believe it. And when I found out that there was actually a field where you learn about that kind of stuff, that was it. I was hooked. I was like, that's what I need to learn. That's what I want to go into. So in college, I enrolled in psychology. I got my bachelor's in arts and psychology, cum laude. And then I went on to get my master's in professional counseling and then get my license from the state of Arizona. So something that started at age 6 really had an impact on my life. So how does that impact how I write now? Well, honestly, I think it has to do with how I develop my storylines and develop my characters. I am a firm believer in that the character comes first, the world comes second. Or to be more accurate, the world comes third, the plot comes second. Because I've always had this belief that if you make your characters interesting, you can put them in the most boring, trivial setting imaginable, and it will still be entertaining. I often use the phrase, if your characters are interesting enough, I will enjoy watching them wait at the DMV. And I still stand by that. Because people in general are interesting. Our little intricacies and the way we think, the way we interpret things, that's all fascinating to me. Because a lot of times people don't realize the things in their background that still affect them today. I'm talking about things like attachment, your attachment to your parents, but also your attachment to your siblings, your attachment to your other family members. People don't realize the impact that trauma can have on someone. And trauma is completely individualized. So what is traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another, but it definitely colors how you interpret things and how you begin to react to things. If you take someone who has never been exposed to trauma and you take someone that has, and you raise them in the exact same way, the person that has been through trauma is going to interpret the world in an entirely different way. One of the things that we often use in training to explain this is that if you take two people that have never been exposed to trauma and you show them a stick on the ground, they're both going to say, it's a stick. If you take someone who has been exposed to trauma, their initial response is going to be, well, it might be a snake. Because trauma sets your brain into essentially survival mode. And even when the trauma has passed, and even when you hopefully get therapy and move past it, it still lingers there. That doubt still lingers there. And a lot of times what therapy is teaching people how to catch themselves when they start thinking this way and reframe it. And so that shows up in all my writing. That doesn't necessarily mean that trauma is going to be in all my writing, but it means that events in the past will affect the present is going to be in my writing. This is also why I love the family tropes, both the good ones and the bad ones, because family is one of the most influential entities on a person, because you are with them typically the most out of your developing years. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this, but as a general rule, you are with them the most. So they have the most impact on you. And family, and this is why family therapy is difficult, by the way. Families are what we refer to as a spider's web. There is not one patient. The family is the patient. Because you have different relationships with different people under different circumstances. Those can change, those can shift. So if something changes with one person, that twangs all the other strands, and it affects everybody else. It is all an interwoven mess. So that's why in family therapy, you bring the whole family in and you work with the whole family on what the whole family needs to do. Because if you don't, you're only treating one person and you're not treating what the vibrations from that person does to everybody else. So I'm not going to say that it doesn't do anything, but it definitely reduces the effectiveness of it. And I think that is what I love to explore in my writing, is how different events and different interactions affect how people grow, affect how people think, and affect how people really get along with each other. My debut novel, Coexist Division, one of the huge themes in that is how important, one, the past is, and how important communication is. I cannot tell you how many people I have counseled, and the real issue is that their communication skills need help. Because when we don't communicate well, our brain automatically has to fill something in. So they start making assumptions. And assumptions is where you get into trouble. So that's where psychology comes in for me, is I love to explore these different avenues and the ways that you can use a character's past to influence your plot. And like I said before, I truly believe the characters need to come first, because you can have the best plot in the world, and if your characters are not developed and they're not interesting, I really don't care, because the plot is what the characters are essentially riding on. It's the train that they're riding on. But if the characters are not interesting, then essentially you don't have anybody in the train. So why am I interested in where the train is going? The world is the scenery that they travel through. And that's why I believe, especially with world building in stories where it can be very easy to get lost, like sci-fi and fantasy. You really need to filter your world building through your character's eyes. If it's not relevant to the character, then I don't really need to know about it until it becomes relevant to them, because they're my avenue through which I'm experiencing this world. So if it's not important to them, then why should I be hearing about it? Let's see. The other thing is, I really love to dig into the ways that different people think and consider things, because when you work in psychology, you really have to face that not everybody thinks the same way, and sometimes the way that someone thinks it may seem to us to be maladaptive, but that's how that person is at the moment. That's where they're at. So you have to work with them where they're at. Like, okay, if this is the way that you interpret the world, what can we do to make the way you interpret the world easier for you? What can we do to help you? And that can make you create so many interesting characters if you really just take into account what would be an off-the-wall way for someone to interpret this, and why do they interpret it that way. In a sense, you can kind of work backwards. You can come up with a very odd way that someone interprets the world, and then that can make you think about, wonder why they think that way. And then that can lead you to their background. Background, I feel, is one of the most vital aspects of a character. When people tell me they create characters and they don't have a background for them, I really don't get it. I understand that some people, that is their style, but for me, without a background, I don't know why these characters act the way they do. And a lot of times, if there is no background, the way they act can not make sense. I'll give you a good example. I'm going to jump back to the Disney afternoon that got me into this. If you take Tailspin and you take Kit Cloud Kicker from Tailspin, when we were first introduced to him, he's a pirate. He's a sky pirate, and he leaves because he gets fed up with how he's treated. And the way he acts through the rest of the pilot can all be explained by this. His lack of trusting people, his ability to get himself out of difficult situations, him accepting that the only person that's going to protect himself is him. And when someone comes into his life that is willing to do that, he does not understand why. And that fills 5 episodes. I think it was 5. No, 4 episodes. My bad. 4 episodes. Which is essentially 2 hours of just from this simple aspect, because it affects how he interprets the world. It affects how he makes relationships with people. All this stuff becomes relevant. And that's what I try to put in my writing, is make the background relevant, because it's going to affect all aspects of a character's personality. That, I feel, is really where psychology hits me, is the way I develop characters. And the way I develop characters is going to affect my plot. And the way I develop my plot is going to affect my world building. And it's all a spider's web again. And that's really how I view it, is psychology taught me how to develop a good character background. And a good character background drives everything else. I still stand by the best writing advice I have ever received. I received in junior high from one of my teachers, and I feel so bad that I cannot remember who it was, but they pulled me aside and they said, if you make your characters real, they're going to write the story for you. And that is so true. If you put enough energy into making these characters nuanced and layered and realistic, then there's never really going to be a situation where you're going to be, oh, well, how would this character react? Because you're going to know. You're going to know when you introduce a climax, when you introduce a problem, you're going to know, okay, well, this character would do this character would do this. And that's what I love with writing, is meeting all these great new people and seeing how they explore these worlds that are not like our own. All right, guys, so that was kind of a brief dig into my history and why psychology is important to me. I didn't really touch on the aspect of mental health in writing because I had another video where I kind of touched on that a little bit. But suffice to say, I do think that is very, very important. Any kind of representation that can be positive with people that have mental illness is welcomed, and I think we need a lot more of it. So if you guys have more detailed questions about what you want to know in regards to my psychology background and how it affects how I write, please let me know. Or if you have just comments in general, by all means, let me know. I love to read them. I love to find out what you guys think. As always, you can follow me on social media. And if you are so inclined, please subscribe. I will try to have new videos up every week. And until then, take care.